Welcome friends to Literature Mantra. Today's topic of discussion is better and high scoring answer writing strategies. Exams are around the corner and you face the problem of how to write good answers. So what is a good answer and how do you write a good answer? A good answer is one that is multi-dimensional and that closely answers the question. Now what is a multi-dimensional answer and how should you closely answer the question so that you get a high score? Let's discuss all the points that any good answer has. In case you have doubts in any topic related to English literature, you can follow and contact us on social media. We will try to reply as soon as possible. And do connect with Literature Mantra, India's only free online preparation platform for UGC-NET and all English literature based exams. The first point is widely quoting from the given text. Whether the text is a poem or a novel or a play or a short story or even an essay, quote as much as you can from the text. In particular, you should highlight symbols, metaphors, images, and other figures of speech to prove your point. For instance, if you are talking about Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats, do mention the various images used in the poem and don't forget to mention the synesthesia used in the poem. Synesthesia is basically a phrase or a description whereby one mode of sensation is expressed in terms of another one. For example, loud colors, the expression loud colors. To express something visual here, colors, an auditory description is used loud colors. And in the poem Ode to a Nightingale, Keats calls for a draught of wine. It begins, "Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and provincial song and sunburnt mirth." So here, using this synesthesia, Keats calls for a drink tasting of sight, color, motion, sound and heat. So the point is widely quoting from the given text and in particular quote metaphors, symbols, images and other literary devices to prove your point. And while writing answers, do not try to write a summary but mention specific points. The examiner is not looking for a summary but analysis and your impression or understanding of the entire text. The second point is intertextual references. What are intertextual references? Intertextual references are basically bringing in ideas from another literary work to support your answer. For example, if you're talking about Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, then at the beginning, few lines from W.B. Yeats's poem The Second Coming is quoted. This is usually called the epigraph. Even the title comes from this poem. So while talking about Things Fall Apart, you should also talk about the poem. What are the similarities in Yeats's poem and Chinua Achebe's novel? Another example can be if you are dealing with a play like Waiting for Godot. Talk about Albert Camus, Myth of Sisyphus, and the theory of existentialism. Talk about how the things that happen in Waiting for Godot can be explained through these. So intertextual references not just for the sake of extending your answer or adding length to it, but to answer the question as thoroughly as possible using various dimensions. This should be the aim. Do not try to fool the examiners by writing any irrelevant thing. The examiners are very learned people. Most of them have at least MPhil or PhD. They know much more than you do. You might still be doing BA or MA, but they are far more qualified than you are, and they have done much more reading than you have and have many years of experience. So please keep this in mind while you frame your answers. Another example of intertextual references can be if you are talking about T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland. You can mention the date when it was published, which is 1922. But just mentioning the date of publication is not sufficient. You also have to prove how and why it is relevant for the question. So along with this, you can also mention the historical event. For example, World War I, which took place between 1914 to 1918. In this poem, it is not a literal wasteland, but more of a spiritual or a metaphorical wasteland. Rather than a wasteland as a result of war, it is a wasteland due to lack of principles, lack of values, ethics, and so on. So you must mention all of this. You can also compare this poem with poems like Wilfred Owen's poem Dulce Et Decorum Est. Unlike the wasteland, this poem by Wilfred Owen gives a graphic description of the destruction wrought by war. So these are the examples or methods methods you can use to introduce intertextuality or intertextual references in your answers. A related point is biographical information related to the writer. For example, mention some biographical information when you talk about Charles Dickens or D.H. Lawrence. Childhood or adulthood experiences and events tend to shape the works of almost all writers. For instance, during childhood, Charles Dickens had to work in a shoe blacking factory and faced many hardships because of poverty. The various hardships that Dickens had to face in childhood find a mention in his novel David Copperfield. So if you are writing about David Copperfield, do mention biographical information related to Dickens. Then if you are dealing with D.H. Lawrence's novel Sons and Lovers, mention some biographical details about Lawrence's childhood. Many characters in this novel and several events that take place in this novel are biographical, either partially or totally. Then another example can be, if you are dealing with W.B. Yeats, then mention his theory of gyres and also his love for the Lady Maud Gonne. When writing about the poetry of W.B. Yeats, these two things, means the Gyre theory and Maud Gonne, have had a decisive influence on the overall writings of Yeats. These are also mentioned many times in the poems of W.B. Yeats. So these are some of the ways in which you can refer to biographical information when writing answers. But remember, the relevance of every point that you mention is of critical importance. Make sure that the points you mention are relevant for the answer. Then the next point is, mention the era of literary history that a particular text belongs to. For example, if you are talking about T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, it broadly belongs to the period which corresponds with modernism in literary history. The Waste Land is a classic example of a modernist text. So mention what traits or characteristics of modernism are also reflected in The Waste Land. Another example can be Christopher Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus. While writing answers for this particular play, you should also mention the Renaissance man. The questioning spirit of Dr. Faustus is similar to the questioning spirit of the typical Renaissance man. But of course, it has its own dangers and opportunities. Another example can be Alexander Pope's poem, The Rape of the Lock. In this, you can also mention the Augustan era, which was the literary era at that time. In particular, the notion of decorum and why during the Augustan era it was considered that imitating the classical writers was important. You can also compare with Wordsworth's notion of language as used by ordinary men. In other words, the notion of decorum as it was practiced during the Augustan era versus the Wordsworthian notion of language used by ordinary men as practiced in the Romantic era. The point is, you can make such a reference or such references even while you answer a question on the Rape of the Lock. In this way, you are adding another dimension to your answer. The next point is mentioning historical events of relevance. For example, you can mention the French Revolution and the American Revolution while talking about the Romantic era. Mention how Wordsworth's work has been shaped by the French Revolution and how he also gradually got disillusioned or dismayed by the violence and authoritarianism that was unleashed by Robespierre following the French Revolution and later on by Napoleon. We all know that Wordsworth was a supporter of the French Revolution in its earlier phase, but later on Wordsworth was also disappointed by the progress of the revolution, and he says Frenchmen had changed a war of self-defense for one of conquest, losing sight of all which they had struggled for. So this is something which indicates the disappointment of Wordsworth. And then if you are writing about W.B. Yeats's poem such as Easter 1916, then do mention the uprising of 1916 which took place in Ireland against British rule, because this poem is based on that uprising. So the point is mentioning historical events of relevance that might have shaped a particular work or the thinking of a particular writer. Then next point is using the tool of compare and contrast. context. By this I mean mention similarities or differences or parallels. Now, whether you are referring to historical events, literary era, or intertextual works, the tool of compare and contrast can be used everywhere. But make sure that whatever points you add, they should be relevant for the answer. So the aim of writing an answer should be to cover as many dimensions as possible and to make your answers multi-dimensional. This will also give adequate length to your answers as well as a sense of thoroughness and completeness to your answers. This is what ultimately indicates to the examiner that you are not only well read but also thoroughly prepared for the exam. And with this, I wish you all the best for your exams. But do tell us which of these techniques which we discussed above you are going to use first. I am Professor Singh and I'll see you in the next video.